Hey guys, Mr. Passeri here, and it is Friday night, and we have finished the school year. Congratulations. So this video, we are going to go over the answers to your homework, and I'm going to fill in some blanks. I'm being distracted by the drama that's being caused by the Last of Us Part 2. That's a fun tire fire to watch burn. If you want to get your mind off things and drink some late night coffee, right here. Yeah, go Tigers. Anyway, and I got this cool new Ultraman action figure at Heroes and Villains Comic Shop. Support your local businesses now that they are reopening. So, Ultraman, good stuff. So, let's get down to talking about some social studies. So, guys, we finished the Civil War in our readings. Your readings covered the strain of war and the ending of the war. Long story short, the South had better generals in the sense that they were highly regarded, highly trained, highly accomplished, and in particular, the South had people like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, kind of the Michael Jordan. Robert E. Lee would be the Michael Jordan and the Scottie Pippen, the Stonewall Jackson of 19th century, highly regarded war strategists fighting on the side that had a disadvantage in terms of not having manufacturing, not having as many people, not having food crops. They had cash crops, but they did have highly trained generals, an honor-based dueling culture, and in their minds, they believed a righteous cause that whitewashed the brutality of slavery by calling it paternalism. They believed that slaves were their children, they took care of their children, and they were kind of willfully ignorant or deceptive about how bad slavery actually was. Now, the truth is that there were good masters that had good relationships with their slaves. You can go and find minority cases of slaves who sided with their masters in the plantations. Those exist. You can look them up. You can read interviews about them. But the fact of the matter is that when offered their freedom, slaves that even pretended to like slavery would stop playing the game and jump at the chance to get their freedom, because nobody wants to be owned and nobody wants to have the risk of their family being sold away from them. And no one wants to have the threat of violence against them. So while the conditions of slavery were actually improving by the 1860s, it's still slavery, and it's an increasingly unpopular belief to hold in the 1860s. So just keep that in mind. Now, there's a big debate right now about do you define the South totally in terms of its use of slavery, or is it okay to look at other things in the South? People fighting and dying for their homeland because they love their homeland, they love their comrades, they love their region. They might even love their slaves, even if they are stupid and don't understand how bad slavery is. That willingness to fight for what you believe in, that belief that your cause is like the cause of the American Revolution, right? The British Empire was much more progressive on the issue of slavery. The British Empire abolished slavery in 1833 by decree, not by war. The British Empire offered loyalist blacks freedom during the Revolutionary War if they fought for the British side. So the British, were more progressive on the issue of slavery than the founding fathers, many of whom owned slaves. So I'm just showing you the complexity of this issue, guys. So when there are people who want to, in the South, say the Confederacy wasn't all bad, that's where they're coming from. And I think the key thing here is to understand that slavery is an abomination that's not justifiable by any means, but you also need to understand that slavery is one piece of the puzzle in that whole culture. And people are made up of people are like puzzles that are made up of all different pieces. And too often, I think, not even just about the South or anything, I think we, at this point in time, and just in general as human beings, we need to have good communication with each other and not just only look at one thing about one group of people. We need to look at the whole, and we need to listen to each other, and we don't have to always agree with each other, but we need to try to understand genuinely each other's perspectives so that you can build on common ground and enrich your own worldview. Maybe not agreeing 100% with the other side, but at least seeing where they're coming from, and maybe their perspective can make your side a little richer. So just keep that in mind. And the inability to do that is, I think, the biggest reason that you end up getting violent conflicts like the Civil War. Now, for my money, the Civil War was about unity more than about slavery. That might be an unpopular opinion with a lot of academics, because academics tend to be very, my way or the highway. But I think if you look at the facts, Abraham Lincoln was very clear at the beginning of the Civil War that if he could free the slaves and keep the Union, he'd do it. If he could keep the slaves and keep the Union, he'd do it. He just wanted to keep the Union, to the point that he had slave states in the Union. And the abolition of slavery was not a war aim of the Civil War. And it was really more not until 1863 that you get the Emancipation Proclamation that only frees slaves in the Confederacy, which is technically a different country, and the border states in the Union are allowed to keep their slaves. And sadly, and you'll learn about this next year, once Reconstruction happens, you do have a group called the Radical Republicans that are trying to give slaves a lot of rights. Really, because the slaves are going to be the freed slaves are going to be the only group in the South that's going to be really, really, really pro-North, because Abraham Lincoln gave them, ultimately in their minds, their freedom, and he did. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really directly affect Confederate slaves in the midst of the Civil War, but the Civil War ultimately did free slaves. So in the mindset of a lot of African Americans in the South, like, Lincoln was their guy, and they were going to support the Republicans. So obviously, if you're the Republicans trying to rebuild the South, give the slaves a lot of rights. They deserve them too. I'm just saying that the problem with the Radical Republicans and Reconstruction is like, it's awesome that they gave black people rights, but they didn't win enough hearts and minds to people who weren't African American. And the brutality of the Civil War and the stuff that you read about made that very hard to do, and I don't even know if they were 100% willing to do it. And then once the military pulled out of the South, sadly, African Americans were left as sitting ducks for a lot of racist domestic terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, and you end up getting the racial problems that happened in U.S. history. So, and the reason that the Republicans, Radical Republicans in the Union Army left the South during Reconstruction is because they wanted the country to move on, because the bottom line was, we have to be a unified country. We're just tired of keeping this whole part of the country under military occupation, right? So there's that. Anyway, that's a little bit of a 8-minute long rant, but it's a little bit of a preview of what you're going to see next year. Different historians have different views on Reconstruction and the Civil War. Develop your own by listening to a diversity of perspectives. Anyway, Stonewall Jackson, the Scottie Pippen of the South, gets killed by friendly fire. Right? That's the answer to your first question. Number two, he gets that happens to him in the Battle of Chancellorsville. After Antietam, Robert E. Lee moved his army out of Maryland and into Virginia. The term entrenched means to be firmly placed in a region. When General Burnside resigned as the Union commander, Joseph Hooker replaced him. I'm sure you'll all find that name hilarious. Real quick point about the Union, guys. The Union did not have very good generals. They tended to have kind of a revolving door of people that were awed by how good of a general Robert E. Lee of the South was. And Abraham Lincoln, he knew, it's like, I've got more people than the South. I've got more weapons than the South. I've got more manufacturing than the South. There's no reason that these guys can't just go take it to Robert E. Lee. But these guys, like, human life is sacred, guys. So a lot of people were intimidated by how good of a general Robert E. Lee was. And they didn't want their men to die. They didn't want to die. This guy's good in battle, right? So they were scared of him. And it really wasn't until you get to Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman that you get really aggressive Northern generals that really take it to the South and are willing to take massive casualties themselves and then also attack Southern civilians. And that's ultimately going to be the formula that breaks the South. So Stonewall Jackson was shot in his left arm. That's number 5. Number 6, Stonewall Jackson's left arm was amputated. That is true. Number 7, who commanded the Union forces at Antietam? McClellan. Who became the commander of the Union Army after Joseph Hooker's resignation? Meade. 30% of the Southern population was African American, so you have a sizable minority there. Confederates are reluctant to arm African soldiers because they feared they would attack and revolt. That is a very real fear, and that is part of some of the gun culture in the South, is that you needed to have a gun near you to protect yourself from a potential slave revolt, in addition to the fact that there was a lot of honor in dueling that was part of Southern honor. There were instances that have been documented of black Confederate soldiers. There are historians like James McPherson and Eric Foner who rabidly deny that. I think that 100% of anything in history is almost certainly untrue. So the idea that there would be 100% no black soldiers in the Confederacy when you have 30% of your population that's black, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Some of those black soldiers are reported to have fought with guns in their backs. Some of those black soldiers are reported to have fought with knives rather than guns. But then there are also cases where you read about African Americans fighting to defend the plantation, even though it's slavery. It's like they helped build that plantation, and they don't want their work to just go up in flames, literally. And you have instances where you have bonds that happen between slaves and masters, but then you also have instances, and those slaves actually will, in minority situations, choose to stay with their masters. But the vast majority of situations play out where slaves want their freedom, and if they get lethal force, there is a good chance they will use that lethal force to get their freedom, or run away, or whatever. So the bottom line is that while there is likely to have been a small number of African Americans who fought for the Confederacy, they're either going to be really small in number if they're really going to fight for it seriously, or they're going to be not good soldiers because they're going to be unpredictable. And that, I think, is the most honest take I can give you on black Confederates. Why was Lincoln initially reluctant to use African American troops? Because he had slave states in the Union. I think the Union gets excessively romanticized as being anti-slavery. There's definitely the Republican Party in control, and the Republican part of the Union, and the Republican Party is anti-slavery expansion. They have a reputation that's kind of blown out of proportion in many cases as being an abolitionist party, which is not true. Abraham Lincoln was very anti-John Brown, but nevertheless, there was, in terms of the political spectrum at that time, the Republicans were the most anti-slavery mainstream political party. But the bottom line is that they fought to preserve the Union to the point where they had slave states in the Union, and they didn't want to have armed, slaves because they were afraid that those Union slave states were going to get the same kind of spooked that the Confederate slave states were going to get by having armed slaves. And they were also afraid that those, again, because unity, in my opinion, is the bottom line, those border states are going to run to the Confederacy, and the Confederacy is going to get even stronger, and the Union is going to break apart. And in the 1800s, the United States is growing and growing and growing. They're using lethal force to take Native American lands. They're building the Transcontinental Railroad, the westward expansion, policies of the Homestead Act. You have increased violence against Native Americans taking territory through westward expansion. So the idea that the United States was going to shrink rather than grow was not okay in the minds of a lot of people in power in the United States. So, again, that's my opinion on that. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment was the best known African American regiment. African American officers who fight for abolition of slavery should be lauded. That means they should be congratulated in history. They did something incredibly difficult and incredibly dangerous. Number one, running away to try to find freedom, because that was a life. You could easily die doing that. Your master could kill you or mutilate you to punish you and make an example out of you to other slaves. But then to actually get your freedom and then choose to fight. It's I'm not saying everyone has to be a warrior, but people who do take that path should be congratulated for their courage. It's just sad because a lot of them died. So anyway, in your opinion, how should Lee have invaded the North or played it defensively? In my opinion, if Southern culture could handle a guerrilla war, they should have done it. But the Southern generals and the dueling culture of the South was very much rooted psychologically in face-to-face combat. They weren't cut out for guerrilla war, much like the British were not used to the guerrilla war that the Patriots used against them. So that's interesting. In that case, the Confederacy is more like the British and less like the Patriots. But you can have your own opinion on that. You should have your own opinion on that. That's what that question's asking. Define the term encountered. That means to meet. 25,000 people died at the Battle of Gettysburg, and Pickett's charge was an attempt to take the high ground of Gettysburg by Robert E. Lee. The Battle of Gettysburg, despite everything I said about how good of a general Robert E. Lee was, he was either physically or psychologically impaired during that battle through either heart problems or dysentery, which is severe diarrhea. And he was giving horrendous advice to his soldiers to try to basically charge up hills to take Union territory, and they got mowed down in the thousands. I actually went to Gettysburg, and it is an eerie, eerie vibe. There's probably the ghosts of dead soldiers there. I don't know. How did the outcome of Gettysburg affect Confederate foreign policy? England and France decided not to support the Confederacy's bid for freedom because it looked like they might lose the war. Plus, the Confederacy always had that challenge of, on the one hand, politically, they had the moral high ground of saying, we want our freedom. We're not being represented by the U.S. government. We want our freedom. We have the right as states to leave the Union and honor our own culture. But the other side to that is that your culture includes enslaving a whole group of people. And enslaving means these people are fundamentally drained of their dignity as human beings and can have their family sold away from them and can be, beaten and potentially murdered, because the same way that you can take care of your property, it's also your right to destroy your property. 30,000 Confederate troops held Vicksburg. The term siege means to block food and supplies. How long did the siege of Vicksburg last? 47 days. Edward Everett was the keynote speaker at the Gettysburg Address with a speech that was in the range of hours, where Lincoln's speech was in the range of minutes. And Lincoln's Gettysburg Address upstaged, stole the show. Total war. This is your next section. Destroy civilians as well as soldiers, including civilian property. Ulysses S. Grant was an average student. Abraham Lincoln put Grant in charge of Union armies in 1864. So you can already see how the Union is going to start getting really aggressive in the final phases of the war. What's a series? A sequence of events. The wilderness is the area between D.C. and Richmond, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia. Why did some of Grant's critics in the North call him a butcher? Because of the huge loss of life among his troops. Again, Grant was willing to take losses and be aggressive. Why was Petersburg important to the Confederacy? Because it was vital for the movement of troops and supplies. The term resistance means not to submit. On what date did John Hood abandon the city of Atlanta? September 1st. David Farragut was the highest ranking officer in the Union Navy. What percentage of the popular vote did Lincoln receive in the 1864 election? 55%, because the Union started winning the war. Before that, it looked like Lincoln was probably going to lose the presidency, and the Confederacy may very well have gotten their freedom, and then U.S. history would look very different. We'd have to coexist with another country, and then the question would be, how would the South ultimately solve the issue of slavery? You have a lot of people in the South who want to separate the Confederacy from slavery because they look at all the positive things about the Confederacy. You can go on YouTube and listen to the interviews of Confederate war veterans, which are actually fairly interesting. And they'll say things like, I didn't really understand the slave issue. I was just fighting for my homeland. And people focus on that, and that's why people in the South don't think the Confederacy is terrible, because they were fighting for their homeland. But people in the North, who were their enemy, they want to focus on the good aspect of what the North was fighting for, which ultimately became the freedom of the slaves, because the Emancipation Proclamation gets issued in 1863, and as it becomes more of a necessity to keep to strengthen the Union war effort, Lincoln makes the war more and more about slavery to try to get slaves to run away to the Union, to try to appear to have the moral high ground on the international stage. Because if you're just fighting for unity and the South is saying, I want my freedom, then the South looks like the good guy. But if you're saying, I want slaves to be free, then that's much more, making you look like the good guy and them look like the bad guy. Even though it should be said, Lincoln allowed the border states to keep their slaves and only outlawed slavery in the Confederacy. But that would tell Confederate slaves that, hey guys, I'm on your side, So interpreted means to explain how you, I guess it would mean to explain how you make sense of various things. I think your book just says explain, but that's not a great definition. Sherman's march to the sea was the total war burning of Atlanta. Homes, citizens, very brutal. Which of Lincoln's sons toured fallen Confederate capital with him? Tad. On what date did Lee surrender to Grant? April 9th, 1865. Where's Appomattox Courthouse located? It's in Virginia. And how many soldiers died in the Civil War? And this is why the Civil War is not romantic. 600,000 soldiers died. It's the second bloodiest war of the 19th century. People just lost everything. Young men, not, like could be in their teens, early 20s, just their lives are just snuffed out. And it's just terrible. And many of them died not in battle heroically, just from disease, gruesome disease, amputation, diarrhea, infection. So the Civil War is a real tragedy. It's a tragedy in the sense that the United States couldn't solve the issue of slavery any other way than just this insanely brutal conflict. It's a tragedy in the sense that there was such a failure to communicate with each other and a lack of ethics to understand each other. The North, I think, was too arrogant over the South, and the South, there was not enough awareness of the brutality of the institution of slavery. And in the end, the South wanted their freedom, and in the North wanted the country to stay together. And that's my take on the Civil War. The good part of the Civil War that we can all agree on is that slavery was definitively ended in the United States. And that's amazing. The downside to that, though, is that not enough hearts and minds were won in the South after the Civil War to really come to the side of wanting to rejoin the country and wanting to build human relations with people of all political and racial persuasions. And that happens in the North too. There's too much racism, there's too much political division. And that's a big tragedy. There's too much racism, there's too much political division. It was before the Civil War, it was during the Civil War, it was after the Civil War, and it doesn't have to be that way. So, in conclusion, a lack of empathy, an imperialist desire to keep the country intact, a desire to maintain your economic interests, which could be slavery, and your honor as well. All of these things were just ingredients, and also the rising presence of a dislike for slavery among certain segments in the North, with the group known as the abolitionists, as they started to kind of kick up more noise and get some influence within the Republican Party. All those things are ingredients that led to the Civil War and lead into Reconstruction. A very difficult situation for everyone involved. The really, your book kind of ends with what types of questions remain after the Civil War ended. How do you bring the Southern states back, and what is the status of blacks going to be? And those are the really big questions. If you really fought this brutal, bloody war to keep the country together, and the South has its own culture, and you're going to force the South to stay, what are you going to do with them? And what is the South going to do with their black citizens in a way that's going to make their lives better than it was under slavery? Those questions were not well thought out when the war was being fought, and I don't think they were effectively answered during Reconstruction. But it's easy for me to say that sitting here in 2020. But I do think that, once again, if people were more ethical and empathetic, if there was less elitism in the North and less racism in the South, it would have been better for everyone involved. So, that's that. I hope you guys are all well. I hope you have an awesome summer. I'm going to draw some manga, play some video games, and most importantly, spend some time with my family. I will see you guys around in 8th grade, and take care. And until next year, I'm Mr. Passeri. You take care. Bye-bye.